好，大家晚安。
Good evening to everyone.
这个星期一开始我们就来探讨这个中年危机。
So from the beginning of this week, we were sharing about a midlife crisis.
那我们特别是谈针对摩西。
And we were sharing this from the perspective of Moses.
当然我有介绍什么叫中年危机。
And we shared about what it means to go through a midlife crisis.
那也介绍中年危机中年之后所面对的一些挑战。
And also shared on some of the challenges one might face as they go through midlife.
那同时间也跟大家介绍什么叫做灵修。
And we also shared what it means to have spiritual cultivation.
灵修它定包括有3个部分。
And spiritual cultivation will cover 3 aspects.
第一个就是它的教义，它的那个信仰的观念。
Firstly, the first aspect is covering the doctrine in terms of our belief system.
第二个就包括它的价值观。
And second is your value system.
换句话说，它有一个选择跟取舍的这个动作。
And the value system would drive someone to make a decision, to put your focus on one thing and also sacrifice or forgo the other thing.
第3个就是生活方式。
And the third aspect in our spiritual cultivation is one's lifestyle.
就是用信仰的习惯来累积他的每天的生活。
It's to build up and cultivate habits in line of our faith.
那我们有在介绍有关于这个摩西的中年。
And we also talked about what Moses experienced in his midlife.
他做了一个很大的转变。
How he had experienced quite an extreme change.
他想要放弃他这个王子的身份。
And how he wanted to forsake his identity as a prince.
因为他看见他弟兄受苦，希伯来人受苦。
Because he saw the sufferings of his Hebrew brethren.
他想要跟他们站在同一边。
And he wanted to choose to stand on their side.
所以当你看到他打死一个埃及人这件事情之前，其实他做了很多的挣扎。
And therefore we can appreciate how before he struck this fatal blow to this Egyptian, even before then he had a lot of struggles within him.
这是在希伯来书11章所给我们的一些讯息。
And these are the messages that we can gather from Hebrews chapter 11.
那当他决定要跟百姓受苦的时候，
And once he made a decision to suffer together with God's people,
他决定想要拯救他的百姓的时候，
when he made the decision to want to save his own people,
这个时候你发现他的理想跟现实是冲突的。
you will find that at that time his ideals and his hopes and wishes is far from the reality.
因为在他那个时候，他能够拯救百姓的方法就是革命。
Because for him at the time, the only way he could deliver his people away from bondage was through the means of revolt and revolution.
所以圣经说他说这个事情必被人知道了。
So the Bible describes how Moses was afraid that this matter was made known to others.
这个是指的说他想要做希伯来人的首领跟审判官这件事情。
And this matter referring to the matter where he wished to become a ruler and a judge over the Hebrew people.
那也只有这种领导他们的方式，才有可能从奴隶身份转变过来。
So at the time, it was only through this means that he was able to deliver his people out of slavery.
圣经说，希伯来书说他不怕王怒离开埃及，因着信不怕王怒离开埃及。希伯来书这样讲。
The book of Hebrews describe how Moses, not fearing the wrath of the king, he forsook Egypt.
那我们以为是没有他杀人很害怕，应该是害怕离开埃及，应该是这样讲的。
Our initial understanding was that Moses was afraid because he killed the Egyptian.
但是没有想到圣经希伯来书说他是因着信离开埃及，他不怕王怒。 这样子。
However, we see from the book of Hebrew, the author interpreted this as it was by faith he left Egypt.
所以我有解释在出埃及记2章第15节。
And so I've also shared how back in Exodus chapter 2 verse 15,
这个第14节说，这个事必被人家知道，是指的前面说谁立你做我们的首领跟审判官这件事情。
So in Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, when Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known, this thing is referring to the earlier part of the verse where the matter of him wanting to be a prince and a judge over the Hebrew people.
所以15节说法老听见这个事，也是指上面这个事情，是要摩西想做希伯来人的首领跟审判官这件事情。
And therefore in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, so this matter is the same thing referring to what was described in verse 14 of Moses being the leader of the people.
所以后面说摩西从法老的面前离开。
And latter part of verse 15, it says Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh.
换句话说，摩西杀了人之后，他还是有进到皇宫里面去。
In other words, although after Moses killed the Egyptian, he was still able to present himself in the court of Pharaoh.
那对他讲，这个中年是过得非常痛苦。
And after his escape, his middle life was lived in much suffering.
他不想要成为王子，然后继续看到他的百姓受苦。
He refused to identify himself as an Egyptian prince and to witness the suffering of his people.
然后好像跟自己没有关系。
And he refused to take this path as if the sufferings has nothing to do with him.
他想带领以色列百姓来反抗政府，以色列百姓不想这样做。
His intention is to lead the Israelites to rebel against the Pharaoh and his authorities, but the people does not wish to follow him.
结果他只有第3条路，所以他就圣经还说因着信离开了埃及，这样。
And therefore he had no other choice, and he chose the only option he had was by faith he left Egypt.
而且圣经说他还是忍耐哦，圣经是这样讲。
And the Bible also describes how he had to endure.
换句话说，他到旷野之后呢，如果他后悔的话，他随时可以恢复到王子的身份。
In other words, if while he was staying in the wilderness, if he were to regret this decision, he would have been able to return to Egypt and to be restored as a prince.
但他忍耐下去，他没有回去这样子。
But he endured and stood firm on his decision, and he did not return back.
40年的生活让他什么都没有。
40 years of life in the wilderness resulted in nothing for him.
我还跟大家说，雅各在舅舅家待20年，还可以变成大富翁嘛。
And I've also shared the example, which is in contrast with Jacob's example, staying with his uncle for 20 years. And in these 20 years, even he was able to accumulate much wealth.
但是摩西40年什么都没有。
But for Moses' case, after 40 years, he had nothing that he owned.
所以这样子的中年，坦白说，真的是很没有成就感。
And for Moses to experience a midlife stage like this would bring someone down because he would not have any sense of achievement.
所以难怪后来神要他带领以色列百姓出埃及的时候，他说：“我是什么人？”
So
他马上就回答这样。
So it explains why when God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses' reaction was, "Who am I?"
所以他代表说已经这40年把他熬着，他对自己甚至都已经看不起了，这样已经质疑自己了，好像。
So we can see how this 40 years of life in the wilderness has already shaped and molded him in a way that he questioned his own ability.
我们知道诗篇90篇是摩西所写的诗歌。我们知道诗篇90篇是摩西所写的诗歌。诗篇的90篇是摩西所写的诗歌。
So Psalms 90 is a psalm written by Moses.
我们有谈到说摩西的中年危机以及灵修嘛，我们特别还谈到灵修。
And our topic for this week has been the midlife crisis of Moses plus spiritual cultivation.
换句话说，我们在面对中年危机的时候， 外面给我们很多的方法，让我们怎么度过中年危机，你可以自己去查了。
So when we are faced with crisis in our midlife, there's a lot of resources in this world that gives us suggestions and ideas how to face this challenge.
但是摩西他给我们用属灵的眼光来面对来看我们的人生。
However, what we can learn from Moses is that he teaches us how to face the challenges of our life with spiritual insights.
所以礼拜三我们才讲说诗篇的90篇第1节到第10节，其实在讲两件事情。
So we touched on how in Psalms 90 from verse 1 to 10 talks about two things.
第一件事情就是人生很短。
The first thing is that a human life is very short.
它的结局就是尘土。
And man's ending is to return to dust.
那第二件事情就是人生很苦。
And the second thing in this section is that life is full of sorrows.
那最主要的关键就是因为神的愤怒。
And the reason of these sorrows is because of God's wrath and anger.
神为什么愤怒？是因为人的罪而已。
And the reason for God's anger and wrath is because of our iniquities.
所以接下来你会发现，他面对人生的这种困境的时候，都是用观念、用想法来克服。
Therefore, you would find that for Moses, in order to face the obstacles and challenges of his life, it is depending on the change in his mindset.
所以12节说第一个说要我们学习怎么去用智慧的心数算自己的日子。
And we can see in verse 12, the first method is to teach us to number our days.
换句话说，我们要很清楚知道，其实人生很短。
In other words, we need to realize that our life in this world is short.
所以我们必须要好好善用我们有限的时间。
And it's very limited, and therefore we need to make good use of our time.
那这个数算其实它就是用那个所谓支出跟收入的方式去算的。
And so the word number has the meaning of calculating what is our input and what is our output.
那我也曾经介绍说，其实我们在数算日子当中，我们可以多一个项目是我要怎么去分配时间。
So I've already shared that when it comes to numbering our days, we can also look at it from the perspective of how do we allocate our time.
在每一天都有所谓的工作时间。
And that in every day, we would allocate some time for us to work.
休息时间。
Time to rest.
学习时间。
Time to learn.
还有灵修的时间。
And also time to have devotionals and spiritual cultivation.
那另外一个是说乘法，就是说你怎么样让你的时间加倍。
And the other way of numbering our days is the multiplication method, is how do you maximize your time?
同样的5分钟，你用在自己的身上，就纯粹就是5分钟。
So the same 5 minutes, if you were to spend on yourself, that is 5 minutes on yourself.
但是当你这5分钟用在多一点身上的时候，它就有加倍的作用。
And however, if you use the 5 minutes on other purpose or for others, then it would have added value.
这个是我们星期三说的啦。
So this was what we covered and shared on Wednesday night.
那既然人生很短，
And since our life is limited,
但是摩西给我们另外一个很不错的想法。
Moses here gives us another good suggestion.
我们看第90篇的第1节。
If we read chapter 90, Psalms 90, verse 1.
请读。
Chapter 90, verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations.
我们每一个人都需要有一个所谓的居所。
All of us here have our own dwelling place.
这个对摩西来讲，他感受很深刻。
This concept of dwelling place, it has a deep impression on Moses.
因为他中间的40年，从40岁80岁都在牧羊，都做牧羊人。
Because for Moses, between 40 years old and 80 years old, he was living as a shepherd.
那牧羊人是最没有一个定居的地方。
And a shepherd would live a very nomadic lifestyle.
那80岁到120岁，这个又是另外一个流浪的日子。
And between when he was 80 years old to 120 years old, it's another stage of his life, but he also wandered around in that time.
所以代表说他人生2/3的时间都在流浪，没有定居的地方。
Therefore, we can say that for Moses' life, 2/3 of his lifetime was spent in a temporary place where he was moving around.
所以你可以理解为什么摩西在最后一直要哀求神，让他能够进迦南地。他这个是他人生的好像最大的一个希望。
And therefore, we can understand why, towards the end of his life, Moses pleaded for God to allow him to enter into the land of Canaan. That was his greatest hope.
他想要看看他跟他的民族定居的地方在什么地，这是什么样子。
And he wanted to see the actual place where he and the people of God would be dwelling to settle down.
但是事实上他的属灵眼光非常清楚。
However, for Moses, he was very clear in his spiritual discernment.
他说：“神，你是我们的居所。”
Because he says here, Lord, you have been our dwelling place.
那个74译本是翻成你是我的避难所。
And in the Septuagint, it translates this verse as, Lord, you have been our refuge.
我相信大家都有感受你赚的钱当中最大的部分是开销是发在住的这个部分。
So I believe all of us have this experience that in our salary, a large portion of our income is spent on our dwelling.
比如说有些人现在买房子要付贷款，那贷款是占了薪水蛮大的一部分。
For example, we were to buy a house and you have to take out a mortgage, a large part of your income would be spent to pay off this mortgage.
那如果今天你是真的是你会发现当你要决定要买房子的时候呢，哇，你的眼光是看长期的嘛，对。
And therefore, you would find that when you make the decision to want to purchase a house, you would have a long-term view of your decision.
所以你考虑这个条件，我住在这个地方要什么样的条件
And you would have many consideration about choosing the location of your home.
比如说离车站近一点，这个上下班方便一些。
For example, you want to choose a location that is close to public transport, so it's convenient for you to travel to and from work.
或是能够这个 view 好一点能够早上打开心情又比较愉快。
Or perhaps you want to choose a location that has a nice natural view so that every morning when you wake up, you will be able to appreciate natural beauty.
或是考虑学区，让小孩子读书能够有好的更好的读书环境。
And perhaps for some, your consideration is thinking about your children's education, so close to school.
因为这个是我们的家所以说你值得我们长期投资的地方。
And because this location is to be your home, and therefore you would have a long-term view and a long-term consideration of where your dwelling place will be.
所以你一天当中最宝贵的时间就是下班了回家，哇，这是最大的意义了，这今天的最大的意义。
And for many of us, the most precious time of the time of the day would be when we finish our work and we go home and spend time at home.
所以摩西用这个概念是说，你用这个概念谈神是我们居所，神是我们的家，神是我们这个永远的依靠。
And therefore, Moses uses this concept of dwelling place to share with us that God should be our dwelling place, God should be our home.
换句话说，你可能人生要
a portion of our income to invest in this our long-term dwelling place, and therefore we also need to spend a portion of our time every day to invest in our spiritual home.
那如果这个能把握住的时候呢，这个短暂的时间它就会产生的价值。
And if we are able to grasp this concept, then even though our life on earth is limited, but our life is meaningful.
你投资股票、投资房地产都有可能下跌。
And although for now, if we were say to invest in shares or real estate, it is also possible for those values to go down.
比如说最近美国这个预测这个利润会上涨，因为那个通货膨胀很严重。
So recently, the news that's coming out of the US is that because of inflation, to control the very steep inflation, so they've increased the interest rates.
哇，所以他希望把那个钱把它把那个外面的流通的钱把它收回来，政府。
So the government has this fiscal policy to want to gather and collect all the money that has been issued.
然后又这个俄罗斯准备要跟乌克兰打仗。
So we also hear news about Russia preparing to go into war with Ukraine.
哇，那个整个世界就很不稳定了。
So we hear news that causes a lot of instability and uncertainty in us.
但是你投资神不会掉价的，神不会说让 market 掉价，不会的。
However, if you were to invest in God, then it's guaranteed that God will not let your investment go down in value.
那第二个我们来看这个90篇。
And the other thing is we come back to Psalms 90.
第13节到第15节。
Verse 13 to verse 15. Psalms 90, verse 13 to 15. Verse 13. Return, O Lord, how long? And have compassion on your servants. Verse 14. Oh, satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. 15. Make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us, the years in which we have seen evil.
接下来摩西也教我们怎么样去度过这所谓的中年的危机，或者是人生的一个危机，也可以这样讲。
So in these 2 verses, Moses also give us an idea how to face midlife crisis or crisis in general in our lives.
就是他要我们要去面对一些人生的负面的因素。
And so Moses teaches us that we need to confront the negative aspects or negative factors in our life.
换句话说，就是要面对神的愤怒了。简单这么讲。
In other words, we need to confront and face the wrath and anger of God.
刚刚讲过，我们人生又苦又短，就是因为神的愤怒嘛。
So we mentioned earlier the reason why our life is limited and it's also full of sorrow is because of God's anger and wrath.
所以第13节他就跟神祈求了。
And therefore we see in verse 13, Moses pleads to God.
说神啊，就求你转回。
And he asked the Lord to return.
那这个转回是什么意思？
So what does it mean to return or turn back?
好，我们看一下这个申命记第32章。
We can refer to Deuteronomy chapter 32.
申命记32章36节。
Deuteronomy 32 verse 36. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 36. For the Lord will judge his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there is no one remaining born or free.
换句话说，前面你会发现神会为人后悔，是因为他看见人的软弱。
So the reason why God will turn back is because he sees the weaknesses of men.
然后呢，因为这边说无论是困住自由都没有剩下，就代表说非常的少这样子。
So here it describes a situation where there is no one remaining, even those who are in bondage or freed, meaning that there is not many people left.
所以才有那个 compassion on his service， 所以才有这个字出现。
So this trigger the compassion of God.
就是说神所谓的后悔，就是能够转变这种很窘境这种不好的状态。
And so because God had compassion, and therefore God will turn back and change the people's condition.
好，那如果我们知道神的后悔是指这个时候，我们再看回刚刚这个诗篇的90篇。
So this verse tells us the meaning of asking God to return or turn back. And if we were to come back to Psalms 90.
所以说神啊，求你转回，为你的仆人后悔，就是因为我已经过得很不好了，所以后面才有这些事情。
So in verse 13, Moses pleads to God to return and to have compassion on his servants.
我们想想看，摩西在40岁到80岁这段期间，真的是很悲惨的。
So if we can imagine how Moses, when he was between 40 to 80 years old, so he would be living a life that is filled with sorrows.
如果那个时候不是因着信他忍耐的话，他可能撑不下去。
And unless he had the faith to and continue to endure, then it's possible that he would not be able to continue his life there.
但坦白讲，40年不算短哦，真的蛮长的，40年算蛮长的。
40 years is quite a significant time.
你想想看，如果一个人从出生到40岁的时候，可能小孩子都已经有时候都已经国小了，对不对
？So if you imagine for someone since they were born, and if they are now in their 40s, they would probably very likely to have a family and children that is in primary schools.
所以他一直想要说，那快给我转回这种窘境，然后呢，但他又说还要多久？他还一直在强调还要多久这样。
And so we see how this prayer of Moses to plead to God to turn back and to have compassion on his situation because of the affliction that he experienced.
但是第一步一定是对的。
And this first step that he took is correct.
对，就是因为他会抓住神，哇，真的是在那个危机情况中，他我先想到神啊，还要多久？求你转回，一直在想这个事情。
Because his first step when he faced crisis in his life was to grasp hold of God, to be reminded of God and ask God for help.
那让他能够这样持续忍耐，还有一个最主要关键就是第14节。
And Moses was able to endure the situation. The other crucial factor we can see is in verse 14.
他等于是说，从早上一大早就可以看到神的爱满足我们。
And in verse 14, Moses was able to see and experience the mercy of God and the love of God from early in the morning.
所有的满足的意思就是说，你能够接受某件事情。
The meaning of satisfy here in this verse is, sorry, preacher.
就是你能够接受某件事情而感到心里很平静、很愉快这样。
So the meaning of satisfy in this verse means that you are able to accept and be content of your situation.
那通常它是用在这种你肉体的需要就是你得到的东西超过你肉体的需要。
And usually this word is often used in a situation where you are able to be satisfied in terms of your physical needs. The things that you receive is more than what you need.
对，比如说你肚子很饿。
For example, if you were to feel hungry,
就有人带你你就去吃那个 all you can eat 那样自助餐。
someone or you yourself take yourself to a place where you can have all you can eat buffet.
哇，那你心里很满足啊，这个可以吃，那个可以吃，对，就是这个字啊。
And then you'll be very satisfied because you can eat a lot of things. So that meaning there is what we see here in this word satisfy.
所以中文写得很好，中文那个饱得，它中文是用这种吃饱的那个满足吃饱的满足这样子。
And in the Chinese translation is also translated quite well because it uses the word to be filled.
第二个字他说慈爱这个字mercy 这个字。
The other word that we can see in this verse is mercy.
那其实 ESV 翻的比较准，ESV 翻的很好，就是steadfast love， 这个翻的比较对。
And in the ESV version, it translates it with a bit more accurately to instead of mercy, it uses steadfast love.
换句话说，他这个爱是基于说某种的更重要的关系啊。
And so this love comes out of it underscores the important relationship between the two parties.
这个就好像学校的老师
So for example, a teacher in school.
对他的学生的爱跟对他的儿女的爱，那绝对是不一样的。
The love that a teacher has for their students is different from the love that this teacher have towards their own children.
那如果这个老师没有像爱他儿女的这种爱对他的学生的话，那个学生不会说老师你没有爱心，不能这样讲。
And if the teacher treated his own children differently from the way he treated the students cannot say to the teacher and complain that the teacher doesn't love them.
因为关系不一样关系不一样。
because the nature of their relationship is different.
所以这个字更准确翻译叫做 loyal love 这种忠贞之爱，忠贞之爱。
So a more accurate translation of this word would be loyal love.
换句话是说，今天神的爱是因为基于某种关系，这个关系是跑不掉的，所以神一定会爱我们，应该是意思是这样。
In other words, the love God showed towards us is built upon our special relationship with Him, and therefore it doesn't change.
那坦白讲，这个不是很容易啊。
And to love in this manner is not easy.
如果我们今天是碰到事情，然后比如说生了一场大病，那病好了，你就可以神爱我，你可以马上就感受到。
And for example, if we were to experience a grave sickness, and after we are healed, then we would come to the conclusion that God loves us.
但是如果你每天像摩西一样，早上起来就带羊出去，然后时间到再回来，那就比较难体会了。
So in that example, it'd be easier to experience God's love. However, if you were in the shoes of Moses, where every day you would live as a shepherd and live a very harsh life to look after the sheep, then your experience of God's love would be different.
因为每天都一样啊，而且路也反正就是面对这些羊而已啊。
And because Moses lived a very monotonous life, and he does the same thing every day, and he would be facing the same flock of sheep every day.
所以这样子的体会可能是要用你更多的思考来去看到神的爱这样。
And when he's living in such a manner, then it requires for Moses to be able to think in a deeper manner in order to appreciate and feel the love of God.
那要怎么样子去体会神的爱？
And how do we experience and feel the love of God?
所以第14节说好，叫我们一生欢呼喜乐，对不对？好。
And in verse 14, it tells us that we may rejoice and be glad all our days.
而且第15节是说，你使我们喜乐，是照着我们受苦日子跟灾难日子这样。
Verse 15 also mentions, make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us.
如果我们的喜乐是照着我们欢乐日子，这个比较容易理解。
If our gladness is because of the days that we can spend in celebration, then it's easier to understand.
比如说我们出国玩放这个休假，哇，那你会喜乐嘛？这是照我们欢乐的日子，对不对？
For example, if we were to take some leave and go overseas to travel, then we'll be very glad because they are happy days.
那如果你今天是去医院，那这个怎么可能喜乐照着你受苦的日子呢？这个怎么解释？
But in contrast, if you were needing to spend every day visiting, going in and out of hospital, then how are we able to be glad in the days which God has afflicted us?
所以这个是摩西他给的另外一个一种所谓人生的这个智慧的眼光。
So this verse which Moses have penned here gives us another wisdom which Moses share with us when we face challenges in our life.
因为他相信说神会给我们忠贞之爱。
Because he deeply feels that God's love towards us is a steadfast and loyal love.
他对我们的爱绝对跟他对其他人类是不一样的。
And the love that God gives us is different from others.
因为关系不一样。
Different from the love that others show to us because of the nature of our relationship.
但是现在神给我们的遭遇是我们所不喜欢的，是受苦日子，是遭难日子。
However, there may be situation where the days which God allowed us to experience are days of affliction.
那它背后最后结果一定是很有它的价值，它的意义在的。
And though this may be the case, but we need to remember the underlying purpose behind God's intention is a valuable one.
我每次解释这一节的时候，我都通常用妈妈做例子，大家就很容易理解。
So whenever I explain this verse, I often use the example of mothers to help us understand.
每一个做母亲的要面对生产的时候都是痛苦的。
So every mother, as they are facing giving birth to a child, then they would know that it's going to be painful.
这可以是说人生人的所有的痛苦指数当中最高的最
And
痛的。
labor pains is the biggest or the most painful experience one can go through.
那有些人就是生了一个就不要生了，但就还第二个第三个就出来
So for some mothers, because of the painful experience, sometimes they perhaps would just choose to have one child, and that's enough.
但是你会发现当他们生小孩才出生那一刻听到小孩哭，抱着小孩，那就是一个满足这就是满足。
However, you find that though the mothers experience excruciating pain during labor, but the moment the child is born and they hear the child's cry and they have the child in their bosom, then they are satisfied.
所以代表说他的这个满足的喜乐是从他刚刚受很痛苦很艰苦的那个过程得来的，这样。
So this satisfaction and contentment only comes about because they have experienced this painful process.
好，那另外一种例子就是肾结石那 kidney stone kidney stone。
Kidney stone.
对
And the other examples I would give is when we have kidney stones.
那痛得不得了，对不对
And so if you have kidney stone, it's a very painful thing.
那结果呢终于把那个石头排出来了
And it takes a long time. It's very painful to try to have the stones out of your system.
绝对不会有人拿那个 kidney stone 放在一个小盒在那边亲，好可爱我终于把你拉出来了不会有这样子。
So this is in contrast. So the contrast of the example of mothers giving birth contrasts to the experience of when you have kidney stones that has been extracted from your body, then you won't save this stones up in a jar and treasure it.
对，因为这个没有的什么喜乐而已因为
these stones does not give you a lot of joy.
但是妈妈就不一样，我抱着小孩子亲哇，很辛苦，但是很喜乐
But it's different for mothers, for the child that came out of them, because the child gives them a lot of joy.
好，所以感受到神的爱，就是可以从这种苦难当中找到那个价值，让我们从苦难当中能够得到喜乐。简单这么说。
And therefore, how are we able to experience the love of God? Is when we have gone through sufferings and affliction, and we are able to appreciate and understand the value and the purpose behind these afflictions.
好，所以有人这么说说这个摩西在旷野40年
And some people say that Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness.
圣经是没有写圣经是没有这样写
And so this is not mentioned in the Bible.
说每天这些羊
but some people say they imagine every day Moses would face the same flock of sheep.
骂他也没有用，打他也没有用
And even despite how Moses would treat them, even if he treated them badly, he would not get a response out of the sheep.
所以这个40年磨练，难怪摩西的这个是的谦和胜过世上的一切一切的人，圣经这样讲。
This is why this situation is able to train Moses so that he becomes the most humble person.
这没有经过这些羊的训练，碰到这些以色列人，气都气死了
Because without the training of these sheep, and his temper would not have been so gentle and humble towards the Israelites later on.
当然虽然圣经没有写这样讲，我可以接受了，也确实是这样子的
So though the Bible did not explicitly said that this was the case in his training, but this saying is also reasonable and acceptable.
好，那最后我们来看从第16节到第17节
And finally, we will look at from verse 16 to 17. Verse 16, let your work appear to your servants and your glory to their children. Verse 17, and let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands.
要怎么样去面对这个中年的危机
So what are the other ways that we can face the crisis in our midlife?
对我们来讲，我们要建立一个能够看见神作为的信心
So we need to build up and cultivate a faith that allows us to see the works of God.
换句话说，如果我们能够从细微的观察看见神作为的时候，
And if we are able to pay careful attention and observe the works of God around us,
我们就不会说在中年在评估自己，或是觉得好像理想跟实际差距很大的时候，我们就感到一种灰心。
when we look at it from this perspective, then when we are experiencing a large gap between what is our ideal and what is the realities when we are in our midlife.
所以16节他说：“愿你的作为向你的仆人显现了。”
And in verse 16, it says, "Let your work appear to your servants."
那他从2个角度来看。
So it's from two perspectives.
第一个角度就是子孙，就是我们下一代。
First perspective is talking about our descendants, our next generation.
那第二就是工作。
The other perspective is talking about our work.
好，我们先从子孙来看，16节这么说。
So if we're looking at from the perspective of our descendants or the next generation,
神的荣耀向他的子孙显明什么意思？
so what does it mean to let God's glory appear to their children?
神的荣耀常常在我们日常生活当中显明出来。
So the glory of God would manifest itself through different areas of our life.
就像我刚才讲的，你可能是经过患难，没有信主人，他可能好像 kidney stone， 那我们信主人好像妈妈生小孩，就差别在这个地方。
So just like what was the example shared just now, even though we face affliction, for those who do not believe in God, they may take this affliction just like passing of the kidney stones. But for those who believe in God, the days of affliction is just like going through labor pains and give birth to a child.
因为你看到他背后的这个神的所谓的荣耀啊，神的很正面的正面的动机啊，很好的动机这样啊。
And the difference is because we are able to see the motive or the intention of God in allowing us to face these days of afflictions.
所以他就显出他的价值出来了。
So these days of afflictions, because of this understanding, reveals the true value of these afflictions.
那这种想法不是只有我们看见，也包括我们的儿女、我们的子孙也看见。
And this type of mindset is not only what we can experience, but it's also what our children can see in our lives.
换句话说，我们中年的人，如果他可以把这样的思想模式带给下一代来讲，其实这是最好的资产。
In other words, for those of us who are in the midlife, if we are able to carry this mindset across and teach them to our children, then that is very beneficial for them.
换句话说，帮助他们在日常生活当中看到神作为，这个是一个很需要学习的部分。
To help our children and next generation to be able to see the works of God in our everyday life, that is actually quite an important thing.
因为你要把一个 coincident 的事情，把它解释成神的奇妙作为，那这个需要信心嘛？
Because if we were to try to explain an event that is seemingly coincidental, but to be able to see it from the perspective of the will of God, this also requires our faith.
那我们常常这样子经历这样子的训练跟这样子的看见哈，那我们可以帮助我们下一代有这样的正面的思维。
So if you were to regularly go through this training of our thoughts, of our mindset, to be able to view events of our life through this perspective, then we will be able to help carry these across to our children.
好，那第二个是我们所做的工哈。
And the other perspective is the work that we do.
那我们所做的工，一般我们如果没有信靠神，我们会把我们的工看就是用比较的方式看我这工是不是成功了这样。
So if we look at our work without regard having God in the equation, then we would end up comparing the effectiveness of our work and evaluating it whether our work is successful or a failure.
这边的这个 work 这边的工作它有个特别的意思。
So the work here in this verse has a specific meaning.
就是你花了很多的力量。
It has the meaning of when you invest a lot of effort on something.
你是去做某件事情，是为了要完成某个目标或完成某个任务。
Invest a lot of effort in order to accomplish a goal
或是一个任务啦哈。
or a mission.
那这个任务一定是有人指派你才会有一个任务嘛。
And if you were going on a mission, then you must have been sent by someone.
所以所做的工被神建立的意思就是让我们就是立根基啊，让我们更稳定。其实它是打根基的意思啊。
So what it means to establish the work of our hands is asking God to build a foundation for our work, to firm up our work.
换句话说，到中年的时候呢，你可能看见所做的事情，就要慢慢从神的眼光来找到那个目标了。
So in other words, in our midlife, whatever we embark on, we need to look at it from God's perspective.
那这个我们最后来看一节圣经节来解释一下了。
And we will refer to another Bible passage to explain this.
我看以赛亚书26章
Isaiah chapter 26,
第12节。
verse 12. Isaiah 26, verse 12. Lord, you will establish peace for us, for you have also done all our works in us.
这边说我们所做的都是你给我们的成就，这个就关键在这里啊。
And so here it mentions you have done all our works in us.
那当是这种事情的时候呢，神就会派定让我们得到平安，这样啊。
And when God has done all the works in us, He will establish peace for us.
那换句话说，比如说我们的工作，老板会给我们一个目标。
For example, in our day-to-day work, our manager would set us a goal.
或是说老板给我们目标，我们自己要找个目标。
If our manager doesn't give us a goal, we need to set our own personal goals.
那如果我们是为了我们的野心设的目标，你会设得很高。
And if we are too overly ambitious, then we would set a very unachievable goal.
甚至已经超出我们能力很多。
And it's not achievable because it's beyond our capability.
但是我们是在神面前设定目标的时候，你就会看见说，什么是你一个合理的目标？这样。
However, when we try to set a goal for ourselves in the eyes of God, then we would need to measure our own ability.
那你达到了那你就开始就心里很满足至少我达到我的要求，达到我良心给我的要求。
And when you are able to set a goal in this manner, and when you are able to achieve this goal, then it means that you have satisfied the requirements of your conscience.
对，那这个工就会慢慢延伸，从你所做的工，包括我们所得侍奉的工，甚至我们的责任等等，这个都是涵盖在里面的。
So you can use the same principles when regarding goal settings in terms of our secular career, as well as applying this same mindset when we do divine works at church.
或是学生他的责任也可以。
Or perhaps for students in terms of fulfilling their responsibility as a student.
好，那如果这样的话，你会发现说，其实你所做的事情就会很踏实，你就不会觉得慌不会觉得很没有安全感。
And when we approach our work in this manner, then you will find that the steps that you take are very concrete, and it won't make you panic or make you nervous.
但是如果你用野心来做你的目标的话，哇，你有达到，你开始心会慌。
But if your goals is driven by your ambition, then if you are unable to achieve your goal, then you feel very anxious.
所以你会投入更多的时间，花了更多的不必要的精力，反而牺牲更多的事情。
And then you would decide to spend more time and effort, and also using and utilize a lot more resources in order to achieve this ambitious goal that you have set.
好，所以这边其实神建立我们的功，其实是从基础开始，从那个根基开始。这个是神所给我们的，圣经所给我们的概念。
What Psalms 90 teaches us that for God to establish the work of our hands starts with the foundation.
换句话说，神会透过我们的良心来检视我们任何所做的事情。
So God will make us allow us or teach us to use our conscience to examine the things that we do in our life.
好，那这个是我们讲做这个第二部分，好，第二方面。
So this is the second aspects of looking at the work.
好，那就是我们从神建立神可以看见神作为的这种信息，在我们的子孙上面，在我们公司上面来做掉啊。
So we can from the faith which God has given to us, we can look at it from these two perspectives. So from the God's work and relaying that to our children, and also from our mindset towards our work.
当然，这个工作不只是神的功劳，应该只有神所建立的任何的事情这样子。
And so the work here is not just referring to our work in our that we do of our own will, but it's also referring to the work of God.
那我这个主题就讲到这边哈。
So our topic for this week we will conclude here.
好，我们一起来唱诗啊。
And let us now sing hymn
467首。
467.